Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins. In the waning days of the 14th century of the Third Age, when the kingdom of Arthedain still flourished under the line of Isildur, there came a time of subtle change, as when the first breath of winter touches the golden leaves, barely felt yet carrying within it the promise of all that is to come. The northern reaches of Eriador had long been lands of peace, where the Dunedain dwelt in halls of stone beside swift-flowing rivers. Yet in those days, as autumn deepened into the 1000th year since the last alliance, there began to be heard whispers of unease from the furthest marches, not the clear alarm of horn and beacon fire, but something far more troubling, the quiet voice of dread that speaks in the watching hours before dawn. In the fortress of Fornost Iran, King Argaleb held court in halls hung with the banners of his forebears. He was a king in the full strength of his years, wise in counsel and strong in war, beloved of his people. Yet on this evening, as the first snows began to fall beyond the tall windows of his chamber, his brow was marked with lines of care. Before him stood Malbeth, called the seer, eldest of the king's advisors and keeper of the ancient law of the north. His hair was white as the snow that gathered on the windowsills, and his eyes held the deep wisdom of one who had walked long in the paths of foresight. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that those who knew him had never heard before. "My lord," said he, "the dreams have come again, clearer now than ever they were. I have seen a crown of iron wreathed in shadow, and heard the sound of wings like thunder in the northern waste. There is a power stirring in the lands beyond the Etten moors." The king set down his wine cup and leaned forward. "What manner of power?" he asked, though something in the seer's bearing told him he would not welcome the answer. "I know not its true nature," Malbeth replied, "yet it feels to me like an echo of the old darkness, the malice that drove the hillmen to war in the days of my grandfather's grandfather. But this is different, my lord, stronger. It has about it the taste of sorcery and of a will that reaches beyond the circles of the world." Outside, the wind had risen, setting the banners to rustling like the wings of great birds, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, though no wolves had been seen in the lands about Fornost for many years. The king rose and walked to the window, looking out over the white fields that stretched away northward toward the dim line of the Etten moors. "Send word to the ranger captains," he said at length. "Let them double the watches on the northern borders, and send also to Rivendell. Elrond's counsel has ever been a lamp in dark hours." "It shall be done, my lord," Malbeth said, bowing low. Yet as he turned to go, he paused at the threshold. "My king," he said softly, "in my dreams I have seen also the breaking of many things that seemed built to last forever. Watch well and trust in wisdom, but know also that there are storms coming that no mortal strength may wholly withstand." When the seer had gone, King Argaleb remained long at the window, watching the snow fall upon his kingdom. In the great hearth behind him, the fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls where the faces of his ancestors looked down from painted portraits. Yet as the night deepened and the wind grew stronger, the king found his thoughts turning not to victory, but to endurance, to the long defeat that is the lot of all mortal things, and to the hope that burns on even when all seems lost. For though he knew it not, in the ruined towers of Carn Dûm, something that had slept long in darkness was beginning to stir. The Witch-king had not yet come to that place. He rode still the fell paths of Mordor, yet already his malice reached out like a groping hand, seeking cracks in the walls of the world where it might take root and grow. The storm that night was fierce beyond the memory of living men, and when morning came, the reports began to filter in from the outlying settlements, of lights seen dancing in the northern sky, of voices heard speaking in no tongue known to mortal men, and of a great shadow that had passed over the land like the wing of some terrible bird. And in the councils of the wise, there began to be whispered a name that had not been spoken aloud for many years: Angmar, the Iron Home, the realm of sorcery and shadow that would rise in the north like a black tide. The rise of Angmar had begun. 3 days after the great storm, when the snow lay thick upon the roads and the streams ran black beneath their mantles of ice, a messenger came riding hard from the northern marches. His horse was foam-flecked and weary, and the man himself bore the look of one who had seen things that would haunt his dreams for many nights to come. He was brought at once before the king, still travel-stained and shivering from the bitter cold. "My lord," said he, falling to one knee in the hall where the fire burned bright against the winter's chill, "I bring word from Captain Beregond at the Norbury garrison. Strange tidings, my lord, and dark ones." King Argalib leaned forward in his chair, his face grave. "Speak then, and fear not to tell all that you have seen." The messenger drew a shaking breath. "It was 2 nights past, my lord, when the wind was howling fierce across the moors. The captain had set me to watch from the old tower that looks north toward the Etten moors, for there had been rumors of lights seen moving in that desolate country. Near to midnight, I saw them myself. Not the steady glow of campfires, but a cold radiance that flickered and danced like marsh flames, yet far too bright and lasting too long." He paused, as if gathering courage to continue. "But it was not the lights that frightened me most, my lord. It was the sound that came with them, a singing, if singing it could be called. High and thin it was, like the wind through broken stone, yet there were words in it, words in the black speech of Mordor, though I know but little of that accursed tongue." A hush fell over the hall, and more than one man made the sign against evil. The black speech had not been heard in the northern lands since the fall of Sauron, and its very mention brought back memories of the dark years when the shadow lay heavy upon all Middle-earth. "There is more, my lord," the messenger continued, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "When dawn came, Captain Beregond sent out a patrol to scout the lands where the lights had been seen. They found marks in the snow, not the tracks of any natural beast, but great furrows as if something huge had been dragged across the ground. And where these marks passed, the very snow was blackened and melted, as if touched by some burning poison." The king was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming slowly upon the arm of his chair. At last, he spoke. "Were any of the patrol harmed?" "Nay, my lord, though they were sore afraid. But there was one thing more that Captain Beregond bade me tell you. At the center of the largest of these marks, they found a stone, black as night, and carved with signs that hurt the eyes to look upon. When they tried to lift it, it burned their hands, though it gave off no heat that could be felt. They left it where it lay and rode back with all speed. King Argaleb rose from his chair and began to pace the length of the hall, his mind heavy with dark thoughts. The descriptions matched too well with the lore of the elder days, when the servants of Morgoth had worked their sorceries in the deep places of the earth. But Morgoth was cast into the void, and Sauron lay defeated, so the wise claimed. Yet here was evidence that the ancient malice was stirring once more, taking new forms and finding new ways to trouble the peace of the world. "Send word to all the garrisons," he commanded at last. "Let no patrol venture alone into the northern wastes, and bid the captains report at once any sign of strangeness in their lands, and summon Malbeth. The seer must hear of this." But even as the messengers were being dispatched, other reports were coming in from across the realm. In the forests of Cardolan, the Entwives who tended the old forest spoke of a blight that was spreading among the ancient trees. Not the natural death that comes with winter's touch, but a withering that left the very wood black and twisted. The elves of Rivendell sent word that their scouts had seen great birds flying high above the misty mountains, birds of a kind unknown to the lore of Middle-earth, with wings like tattered shadows and eyes that burned like coals. And from the grey havens came perhaps the most disturbing news of all. Círdan the shipwright, eldest of the elves remaining in Middle-earth, reported that the very sea itself seemed troubled. The waves that broke upon the western shore were dark and cold beyond the measure of winter, and in their depths strange lights could sometimes be glimpsed, not the clean radiance of Gilgalad's star, but a sickly phosphorescence that spoke of corruption and decay. As the days passed and the reports multiplied, a pattern began to emerge. The disturbances were not random, but seemed to follow the ancient paths of power that crisscrossed Middle-earth like the veins in a leaf, and all of them pointed toward a single conclusion. Something was stirring in the north, something that had been bound or sleeping since the end of the Second Age, now awakening to cast its shadow once more across the world. In the deep places beneath Carn Dûm, where the roots of the mountains reached down into darkness, the ancient stones began to sing with a voice that had not been heard for 1,000 years. It was a song of summoning, of gathering, of the slow coalescence of will and malice into a single terrible purpose. The Witch-king was coming home. The road that led north from Rivendell through the Etten Moors was ancient beyond the reckoning of mortal men, worn by the feet of countless travelers who had passed that way in the elder days when the world was green and fair. Now it was a path of shadows, winding through desolate country where only the hardiest of folk dared venture, and fewer still returned to tell of what they had seen. It was along this road that Gandalf the Grey came riding on the morning when the first thaw began to soften the snow, his grey cloak pulled close about him and his staff gleaming like silver in the pale sunlight. His horse was Shadowfax, greatest of the Mearas, whose silver coat shone like starlight and whose stride could outrun the wind itself. Yet even that noble beast seemed uneasy as they climbed into the wild lands, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring at scents that carried on the bitter air. The wizard had received Elrond's message 3 days past, as he wandered the borders of the Shire where the hobbits went about their quiet business unknowing of the darkness that stirred in the world beyond their green hedges. The words had been few, but heavy with meaning. Strange tidings from the north. The name of Angmar is whispered again. Your counsel is needed. Now, as Shadowfax picked his way carefully along the treacherous path, Gandalf found his thoughts turning to the ancient histories, to the tales of the Witch-king and his realm of iron and shadow. Long ago, when the kingdoms of Arnor still stood strong, that fell lord had risen in the northern waste, gathering to himself all manner of evil creatures, orcs and trolls, wolves and werewolves, and men whose hearts had turned to darkness. For 600 years, his shadow had lain heavy upon the north, until at last the combined armies of Gondor and the remnant of Arnor had broken his power and driven him into the eastern darkness. But evil, as Gandalf knew well, has a way of returning when it is least expected, taking new forms and finding new servants. And if the reports were true, if something was indeed stirring again in the ruins of Carn Dûm, then the free peoples of Middle-earth faced a threat that might prove even deadlier than before. The day wore on, and the path grew ever more desolate. On either side stretched the grey expanse of the Etten Moors, a land of bog and tarn where the mist hung low and the cry of waterbirds echoed mournfully across the waste. Here and there stood ancient stones, worn smooth by wind and rain, marking graves or boundaries whose meaning had been lost in the dark years. Some bore runes in the old tongue of the Dunedain, speaking of kings and warriors who had fallen in the wars against the Witch-king. Others were carved with older signs, symbols of power that made Shadowfax shy away and caused Gandalf to grip his staff more tightly. As evening approached, the wizard came at last to the ruins of an old watchtower, one of many that had once guarded the northern approaches to Arthedain. Its stones were black with age and weather, and ivy had grown thick upon its walls, but it still offered some shelter from the wind that moaned across the moors. Here Gandalf made his camp, though he lit no fire, for light in that desolate place might draw unwelcome attention. As he sat wrapped in his cloak, sharing his simple meal with Shadowfax, the wizard's keen ears caught a sound that made his blood run cold. Far off across the moors, faint but unmistakable, came the howling of wolves. Not the natural call of beasts hunting for prey, but something altogether more sinister, a sound full of malice and hunger that seemed to speak of things that should not be. Shadowfax snorted and stamped his hooves, his eyes rolling white in the darkness. Gandalf laid a comforting hand upon his neck, whispering words in the ancient tongue of Valinor. But even as he did so, the howling grew louder and closer. Soon he could see lights moving in the distance, not the warm glow of torches or lanterns, but a cold blue radiance that flickered and danced like corpse light. The wizard rose to his feet, his staff beginning to glow with a soft white light that pushed back the shadows. Whatever was approaching through the night, he would meet it with the power that had been given to him by the Valar themselves. For he was Gandalf the Grey, Mithrandir the Pilgrim, and he bore the light of Valinor into the dark places of the world. The lights drew nearer, and now he could make out shapes moving within them. Tall figures wrapped in tattered robes, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. They moved with a strange gliding motion, as if they did not quite touch the ground, and where they passed, the very air seemed to grow thick and cold. "Who goes there?" Gandalf called out, his voice ringing clear across the moors. What business have you in these desolate lands?" The figures paused, and for a moment there was silence, save for the moaning of the wind. Then one of them raised its head, and though the wizard could not see its face, he felt the weight of its gaze like a physical thing, cold and malevolent and utterly without mercy. "We know you, Mithrandir," came a voice like the whisper of dead leaves. "You are far from your garden paths and hobbit holes. This is not a place for the grey pilgrim to walk alone." Gandalf planted his staff firmly in the ground, and its light blazed forth like a star. "I go where I will," he replied, his voice steady despite the dread that clutched at his heart. "And I fear no servant of the shadow, be it wraith or demon or fallen mire. Speak your names, if names you still possess, or be gone from this place." The figure that had spoken let out a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could carry within it all the bitterness and despair of the world. "Names," it said. "We had names once, in the days when we wore flesh and walked beneath the sun. But that was long ago, in another age of the world. Now we are the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, the 9 who are neither living nor dead, and we serve one who is mightier than you, grey fool." The wizard's heart grew heavy, for he had hoped against hope that the reports were false, that the ancient evil had not truly returned. But here was proof beyond all doubt. The 9 riders abroad again in Middle-earth, servants of the Dark Lord who had thought himself safe in his tower of Barad-dûr. "Your master's reach grows long," Gandalf said, "but this is not yet his hour. Return to your holes and caverns, creatures of the pit. The light of Arendil still shines upon Middle-earth, and while it does, you shall not prevail." The confrontation with the Nazgûl had lasted through the darkest hours of night, a battle not of sword and flame, but of will against will, light against shadow. When dawn broke grey and cold over the Etten moors, the wraiths had withdrawn, melting away like mist before the sun, but their parting words echoed still in Gandalf's mind. "The necromancer rises again, grey fool. In Dol Guldur he weaves his web of shadow, and soon all the north shall bow before the Lord of Angmar." Now, as Shadowfax bore him swiftly southward along paths known only to the wise, Gandalf found his thoughts turning to that accursed fortress in southern Mirkwood, Dol Guldur, the hill of sorcery, where for 1,000 years a shadow had dwelt, growing ever stronger while the wise debated and delayed. He had walked those dark halls himself, centuries past, and barely escaped with his life when the necromancer's true nature was at last revealed. Sauron. The name was poison on the wind, a whisper of malice that made even the trees bend away as if in fear. For 9 years now, since the Dark Lord's defeat at the hands of Gil-galad and Elendil, the world had known peace. But peace, as Gandalf had learned through long ages of watching, was often but the breathing space between one darkness and the next. The road turned eastward as it descended from the moors, following the course of an ancient river that had run dry in the dark years. Here the land began to show signs of habitation again. Tumbled walls that had once been farmsteads, orchards long since returned to wildwood, stone bridges that spanned empty air where streams no longer flowed. All bore the mark of the Witch-king's malice, the slow poison that had seeped into the very bones of the earth during his reign of terror. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Gandalf crested a low hill and saw before him a sight that filled his heart with both hope and sorrow. In the valley below, lay the ruins of Fornost Irain, the king's Norbury, greatest city of the North Kingdom. Its walls were broken, its towers fallen, its streets choked with bramble and thorn. Yet even in ruin, there was a dignity about the place, a memory of the glory that had once dwelt there when the Dúnedain were mighty and their realms stretched from sea to mountain. But it was not the ruins that drew the wizard's attention now. It was the smoke that rose from beyond the northern horizon, black as midnight against the pale sky. Smoke that came not from hearth fires or signal beacons, but from the burning of things that should not burn, the very stones and earth themselves, consumed by a malice that sought to unmake all that was fair and good in the world. Shadowfax snorted and shied, sensing his master's disquiet. Gandalf patted the great horse's neck, whispering words of comfort, but his eyes remained fixed upon that ominous pillar of smoke. He had seen its like before, in the days when Sauron's power had been at its height and his armies had marched forth from Barad-dûr to ravage all the lands of Middle-earth. So, he murmured to himself, the necromancer shows his hand at last. But what connection has he to Angmar? What web does he weave in the shadows of Dol Guldur that reaches even to these northern wastes? As if in answer to his question, a great bird came flying from the north, not one of the eagles that served the Valar, but a fell creature with wings like tattered shadows and eyes that burned like coals. It circled high above the ruins of Fornost, crying out in a voice that was neither bird nor beast, but something altogether more sinister. 3 times it circled, and 3 times it cried, and then it turned and flew swiftly southward toward the dark borders of Mirkwood. Gandalf watched it go with growing unease. He had heard that cry before, in the deepest dungeons of Dol Guldur, when the necromancer's servants had sought to break his will with torment and despair. It was a sound that spoke of ancient hatreds and long-nursed plans of revenge, of powers that moved in the darkness while the world slept in ignorance of its peril. "A messenger," he said aloud, and Shadowfax's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice. But what message does it bear, and to whom? Does the necromancer summon his servants to Dol Guldur, or does he send forth his commands to those who serve him in distant lands? The answer, he feared, would not be long in coming. Already he could feel the weight of malice pressing down upon the land like a great hand, seeking to crush all hope and joy beneath its shadow. The Nazgûl were abroad again. The fell birds flew their dark errands, and in the ruins of Carn Dûm, something stirred that had slept since the fall of the Witch-king. War was coming to the north, a war that would make the conflicts of old seem like mere skirmishes, and at its heart would stand a figure wreathed in shadow and crowned with iron, the Lord of the Nazgûl, returned to claim his ancient throne. But not yet, not while the wise still had strength to oppose him, and the free peoples of Middle-earth still cherished the light. Gandalf turned Shadowfax's head toward the south, toward Rivendell and the Council of Elrond. There was much to be done, and little time in which to do it. The White Council must be summoned, plans must be laid, and alliances forged. For if the necromancer and the Witch-king were indeed working in concert, then the very fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance. As they rode, the black smoke continued to rise from the northern horizon, a pillar of shadow against the sky that could be seen for many leagues. And in the ruins of Fornost, where once the kings of Arthedain had held their court in halls of stone and crystal, the wind began to keen through the broken towers like the voice of the dead, crying out against the darkness that was to come. 7 leagues north of the ruined city, where the old road dwindled to little more than a hunter's track through the wilderness, Gandalf came upon a sight that filled him with foreboding. The very ground was scarred and blackened, as if some great fire had passed that way, yet no natural flame could have wrought such devastation. Trees stood like skeletal fingers against the sky, their bark charred and their branches twisted into shapes that hurt the eye to look upon. Even the stones of the ancient road were cracked and melted, fused into grotesque formations that spoke of heat beyond the measure of earthly forge fires. Here, Shadowfax would go no further. The noble horse stood trembling at the edge of the blighted zone, his silver coat dark with sweat despite the cold air. Gandalf did not urge him forward, for he could sense the malice that hung thick as fog over the devastated land. This was no place for any creature that still cherished life and light. "Wait for me here, old friend," the wizard said, dismounting and laying a gentle hand upon Shadowfax's neck. "If I do not return by sunset, carry word to Elrond of what we have seen. Tell him that the shadow reaches farther than we feared, and that the hour of decision draws near." With his staff glowing softly in the gathering gloom, Gandalf began to pick his way across the blasted heath. Each step seemed to echo with the memory of ancient screams, and more than once he paused as visions of terror flickered at the edges of his sight. Phantom armies marching to their doom, cities burning beneath a rain of fire, the very sky torn open to reveal the pit of night beyond. This was the work of the Nazgûl, he realized with growing dread. Not merely their presence, but their active malevolence, pouring forth like poison from a broken vessel to corrupt all that it touched. They had passed this way in the dark hours before dawn, riding hard towards some fell purpose, and their passage had left a scar upon the world that might never fully heal. As he climbed a low ridge that overlooked the wasteland, Gandalf saw before him the source of the black smoke he had glimpsed from afar. In a hollow of the hills stood what had once been a Dunedain settlement, a cluster of stone houses around a central hall, protected by earthen walls and wooden palisades. Now it was nothing but ruin and ash, its buildings reduced to blackened shells and its walls thrown down as if by the fist of some angry giant. But it was not the destruction itself that made the wizard's heart sink with despair. It was the silence. No bird sang in the blasted trees, no insect hummed in the poisoned air. Even the wind made no sound as it moved through the ruins, as if the very atmosphere had been drained of life and substance. This was not mere death, but a negation of existence itself, the mark of the void made manifest in the world of the living. Slowly, carefully, Gandalf made his way down into the ruined village. His staff blazed forth with sudden light as he passed through the shattered gate, and for a moment the shadows seemed to recoil like living things. But they pressed close again as soon as the light had passed, hungry and grasping, seeking to drag down even the servant of the Valar into their endless night. In the center of the settlement, where the village well had once stood, Gandalf found the source of the corruption that had blighted this place. The well itself was gone, replaced by a pit of shadows so deep and dark that even his enhanced vision could not penetrate its depths. From it rose tendrils of black mist that writhed and coiled like serpents, and at its edges stood 9 stones arranged in a circle. Stones that had not been hewn by mortal hands, but shaped by will alone from the stuff of nightmare and despair. Each stone bore a single symbol carved deep into its surface, not runes of power or protection, but marks that seemed to drink in light and give back only darkness. The wizard recognized them from the deepest lore of Valinor, signs that had been forbidden since the music of creation began. They were words in the Black Speech, the tongue that the Dark Lord had devised for his servants in the pits of Udun, and merely to look upon them was to invite corruption into one's soul. But Gandalf was no ordinary being, and his will had been tempered in fires that burned before the world was made. He approached the circle of stones with staff held high, his voice rising in a song of power that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the Elder Days. It was a song of making and unmaking, of the light that was before all darkness, of the flame imperishable that burned at the heart of all creation. The stones began to crack and crumble at his approach, their evil symbols fading like frost before the sun. The pit of shadow writhed and contracted, its tendrils of mist dissolving into nothingness. For a moment, just a moment, the natural order reasserted itself. Birds sang in the distance, the wind rustled through leaves that were green and wholesome, and the very air seemed to lighten and grow sweet. But the victory was brief. Even as the last of the stones crumbled to dust, Gandalf felt a presence behind him, a cold, terrible intelligence that regarded him with hatred beyond all measure. He turned, staff blazing, to face whatever horror had materialized in the cleansed circle. What he saw there would haunt his dreams for years to come. It was a figure tall and terrible, clad in black mail that seemed to drink in light itself. Its face was hidden beneath a crown of iron wreathed with shadow, and in its hand it bore a sword that burned with cold fire. But it was the voice that spoke from beneath that terrible crown that chilled the wizard's blood, a voice he had hoped never to hear again in all the long years of his watching. "So," said the Witch-king of Angmar, "the Grey Fool comes at last to look upon his handiwork. Do you see what your meddling has wrought, Mithrandir? Do you understand the price of your interference in affairs beyond your comprehension?" Gandalf raised his staff, its light blazing forth like a star. "I see only what you have always been," he replied, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his heart. "A servant of the shadow, a corrupter of the innocent, a bringer of despair. Your master may have returned to trouble the world again, but your hour has not yet come." The Witch King laughed, a sound like the breaking of stone. "My hour?" he said. "My hour was 1,000 years ago, when I broke the kingdoms of the north and drove the sons of Isildur into exile and death. This is merely the aftermath, the gathering of the harvest I sowed in blood and tears. Soon all the Northlands shall remember the terror of Angmar, and the free peoples shall learn once more to fear the coming of the Nine. In the depths of Carn Dûm, where no light of sun or moon had ever penetrated, there lay a chamber hewn from the living rock by tools that had never known the touch of mortal hands. The walls were carved with symbols that hurt the mind to contemplate, speaking of torments that transcended the merely physical and reached into the very essence of being itself. Here, in chains forged from shadow and despair, hung a figure that had once been a king. His name had been Arvedui, last king of Arthedain, though few now remembered that title or the glory it had once carried. For 300 years, he had languished in this place of horror, kept alive by the malice of his captors, when death would have been a mercy beyond price. His hair, once golden as the wheat fields of his realm, had turned white as bone, and his eyes held the terrible wisdom of one who has looked too long into the abyss. The Witch King stood before his prisoner now, his iron crown catching and reflecting the cold light that emanated from the cursed stones. Though his face was hidden in shadow, there was satisfaction in his bearing, the satisfaction of a cat that has cornered its prey and means to savor every moment of the kill. "My faithful vassal," he said, his voice like the whisper of steel on stone. "How long it has been since we spoke of the old days. Tell me, do you still remember the sound of your people's screams when my armies swept down from the north? Do you still hear their cries in your dreams?" Arvedui raised his head with effort, the chains that bound him clanking softly in the silence. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse from centuries of disuse, yet there was still a trace of the majesty that had once commanded the loyalty of thousands. "I remember," he said simply. "I remember their courage in the face of darkness. I remember how they stood against your shadow even when all hope had fled. That is what keeps the light alive in this place of despair, the knowledge that evil, however strong, cannot wholly extinguish the flame that burns in mortal hearts." The Witch King struck him then, a blow that would have shattered the bones of a lesser man. But Arvedui had endured worse torments than this, and he bore the pain in silence, his eyes never leaving his tormentor's hidden face. "Still defiant," the Lord of the Nazgûl mused, "still clinging to your pathetic hopes. But hope is a luxury you can no longer afford, last king of a fallen realm. For I have need of you now, need of the knowledge you carry in that stubborn head of yours." He began to pace around the chained king, like a wolf circling wounded prey. "You know the secret ways of Arthedain," he continued. "The hidden passes through the mountains, the ancient paths that lead to the heart of Eriador. More importantly, you know the bloodlines, which houses still carry the blood of Númenor, which children might grow up to trouble my designs. Tell me what I wish to know, and I will grant you the death you have so long desired." Arvedui laughed then, a sound that somehow managed to hold more defiance than despair. "Death," he said. "What is death to one who has already walked in the shadow of the void? I have seen things that would blast the sanity from your mind, Witch King, and still I endure. Do you think I fear the ending of this torment?" "Not death," the Nazgûl Lord replied, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "But there are fates worse than death, as you well know. I could bind your spirit to this place for all eternity, make you watch as I complete the work I began so long ago. Every child of Númenor that falls to my blade, every city that burns in the night, you would feel their pain as if it were your own." For the first time, a shadow of fear crossed the captive king's face. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "Then you would make me truly one with my people," he said. "I have carried their pain in my heart for 3 centuries. To share it with them would be no curse, but a blessing." The Witch King stopped his pacing and turned to face his prisoner directly. Though his features remained hidden, there was something in his bearing that spoke of frustrated rage. "You fool," he hissed. "Do you not understand? The time of ending has come. My master stirs once more in Dol Guldur. weaving his web of shadow across all Middle-earth. Soon the White Council will fall, the wise will be scattered, and the free peoples will know despair beyond imagining. He gestured to the walls around them, where new symbols had begun to appear, not carved by any earthly tool, but burned into the stone by will alone. Already my servants prepare the way. In Fornost, the fell beasts gather, drinking deep of the corruption I have sown there. In the misty mountains, the orcs sharpen their blades and dream of war. Even now, riders go forth, bearing my summons to every dark corner of Eriador. Arvedui studied the new markings, with eyes that had learned to read the language of shadow through long years of torment. What he saw there filled him with a dread that went beyond personal fear, for these were not merely symbols of power, but maps of conquest, showing the planned destruction of every stronghold of light that remained in the northern lands. "You mean to strike at Rivendell?" he said, the words falling like stones into the silence of the chamber. Among other targets, the Witch-king confirmed, "The House of Elrond has been a thorn in my side for too long. His healing halls have given comfort to too many who should have despaired. His counsels have kindled hope where hope should have died. It is time that thorn was plucked from my flesh and cast into the fire." The captive king closed his eyes, his mind racing despite the weariness that weighed upon his spirit. If the Witch-king spoke truly, if an assault upon Rivendell was indeed being planned, then the free peoples had little time to prepare. Elrond's wisdom was great, but even he might not be able to stand against the full might of Angmar if it came upon him unawares. "There is one thing you have not considered," Arvedui said quietly, opening his eyes to meet his captor's hidden gaze. "One factor that may yet overturn all your carefully laid plans." The Witch-king leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "And what might that be?" The fallen king smiled then, an expression of such serene confidence that it seemed to light the very air around him. "The small folk of the Shire," he said. "You discount them because they are neither wise nor mighty, because they care nothing for the great affairs of the world. But in their simplicity lies a strength that your shadow cannot touch, the strength of those who love life for its own sake, who find joy in simple things and hope in the turning of the seasons." For a moment, something that might have been uncertainty flickered in the Witch-king's bearing. Then he straightened, his voice harsh with renewed malice. "Hobbits," he spat, "you place your hope in gardeners and bakers? They will burn with all the rest when my hour comes." "Perhaps," Arvedui conceded, "or perhaps they will surprise you, as they have surprised others before. The wise know that the greatest deeds are often wrought by the most unlikely hands. In darkness, even the smallest light can pierce the shadow." Far to the south, in the shadow of Dol Guldur, where the trees of Mirkwood grew thick and dark, another conversation was taking place, one that would have chilled the heart of any who overheard it. In the highest tower of that accursed fortress, where once the necromancer had held court before his true nature was revealed, two figures stood outlined against the sickly green light that emanated from the cursed stones. One was tall and terrible, clad in robes that seemed to be cut from shadow itself. His face was hidden beneath a hood of black silk, but his voice carried the weight of ancient malice and power beyond mortal comprehension. This was Sauron, the Deceiver, though in this place and time he wore a different name and a different aspect, the Necromancer of Dol Guldur. master of the dark wood, and lord of all that crept and crawled in its poisoned depths. The other figure was smaller, more human in appearance, yet somehow more unsettling than his companion. He wore the garb of a merchant or trader, with rich furs and silver ornaments that spoke of wealth and status. But his eyes were cold as winter ice, and when he smiled, which he did often, it was with the expression of one who finds great pleasure in the suffering of others. "The preparations proceed apace, my lord," the smaller figure was saying, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Your servant in the north has awakened from his long slumber, and already the terror of Angmar spreads throughout Eriador. The rangers flee before shadows, the settlements empty as folk seek refuge in the great cities. Soon the northern kingdom will be ripe for conquest." The necromancer nodded slowly, his hooded head turning toward the narrow window that looked out over the diseased forest. "And what of the White Council?" he asked, his voice like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. "What of the meddling of the wise?" "They know something stirs," the merchant admitted, "but they do not yet grasp the full scope of your design. Gandalf suspects, of course. He has ever been too clever for his own good. But Saruman counsels caution, and the others are divided in their opinions. By the time they act, it will be too late." A sound that might have been laughter echoed from beneath the necromancer's hood. "Saruman," he said with evident amusement. "The white wizard grows proud in his tower of Orthanc, dreaming of power that will never be his. He thinks himself my equal, perhaps even my superior. It will be instructive to demonstrate the folly of such presumption when the time comes." The merchant bowed low, though his cold smile never wavered. "Your wisdom is beyond question, my lord. But there remains the matter of timing. When shall the Witch-king move openly against his enemies? When shall the armies of Angmar march forth to reclaim their ancient dominion?" The necromancer was silent for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on something beyond the mortal plane. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of prophecy, of destiny unfolding according to plans laid down in the dark years of the world's youth. "Soon," he said, "but not yet. The king in chains must first serve his purpose. He will be our unwitting herald, carrying word of our strength to those who would oppose us. Fear is a weapon sharper than any blade, and we shall wield it with precision. Let them know that Angmar rises again. Let them tremble in their halls of stone and dream of the days when peace seemed possible." He turned from the window to face his servant directly, and though his features remained hidden, the merchant visibly shivered at the weight of that regard. "But remember this," the necromancer continued, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "The game we play has stakes beyond the mere conquest of kingdoms. Every move must be calculated, every gambit weighed against its ultimate consequence. For in the end, it is not the North Kingdom we seek to claim, but the mastery of all Middle-earth." The battle between Gandalf and the Witch-king raged through the ruins of the village like a storm of light and shadow, neither giving ground to the other. The wizard's staff blazed with the white fire of Valinor, while the Nazgûl lord's blade burned with cold flame that seemed to drink in light itself. Where their powers clashed, the very air crackled with energies that had not been unleashed in Middle-earth since the Elder Days. "You cannot stand against me forever, grey fool," the Witch-king hissed as his sword met Gandalf's staff in a shower of sparks. I am deathless, timeless, sustained by the will of my master. But you are bound to flesh, limited by the constraints of your mortal form. Already I can sense your strength beginning to wane." Gandalf said nothing, but his jaw was set with grim determination. The Nazgûl spoke truly. This battle could not continue indefinitely. Already he could feel the strain of maintaining his defenses against such concentrated malice, and he knew that if he faltered even for a moment, the Witch-king's blade would find its mark. But he was not fighting merely to preserve his own life. Every moment he held the Lord of Angmar here was a moment's respite for the free peoples of the north. Time for the scattered rangers to carry word of the danger to those who might yet act to prevent it. Time for Elrond to summon the White Council, for riders to go forth with warnings to Lothlorien and the Grey Havens. Time, perhaps, for hope to kindle in hearts that had begun to despair. The Witch-king pressed his attack, his blade weaving patterns of darkness in the air that made reality itself seem to bend and twist. Where its edge passed, the very stones of the ruined village began to crack and crumble, infected by the same blight that had consumed the well at the settlement's heart. This was not merely a weapon of war, but an instrument of uncreation, designed to unmake the very foundations of the world. Yet Gandalf held firm, his staff spinning in his hands as he parried each deadly stroke. The light that blazed from its crystal head grew ever brighter until it seemed like a star had fallen to earth and taken refuge in the heart of that desolate place. The shadows fled before its radiance, and for a moment the natural order reasserted itself. Birds sang in the distance, flowers bloomed among the ruins, and the air grew sweet with the scent of growing things. "Impossible," the Witch-king snarled, momentarily taken aback by the sudden transformation. "This place is mine by right of conquest. I have made it a wound in the world, a gateway to the void. No power of light can cleanse what I have corrupted." "You understand little of light," Gandalf replied, his voice calm despite the titanic forces he was struggling to contain. "It is not something that can be possessed or controlled, not a weapon to be wielded for conquest. It simply is, as natural as the rising of the sun, as inevitable as the coming of spring. And wherever it shines, darkness must retreat." He raised his staff high, and suddenly the entire battlefield was illuminated by a radiance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not the harsh glare of fire or lightning, but something softer and more penetrating. The light of the two trees of Valinor, preserved in crystalline memory and brought forth now in Middle-earth's darkest hour. The Witch-king screamed then, a sound that shattered the last standing walls of the village and sent tremors through the earth for leagues around. His form began to waver and fade, like smoke before a strong wind, and his sword fell from nerveless fingers to clatter on the broken stones. "This is not over," he hissed, as his shape grew ever more insubstantial. "You have won this skirmish, but the war has only just begun. When next we meet, Mithrandir, you will find me less easily defeated, for I have learned much in the long years of my exile, and my master's power grows with each passing day." "Then let it come," Gandalf said quietly, lowering his staff as the last vestiges of the Nazgûl Lord vanished into shadow. "I have faced the darkness before, and I will face it again, for I am Gandalf the Grey, servant of the secret fire, and while light endures in Middle-earth, Evil shall not have the final victory. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant song of birds and the whisper of wind through new-grown grass. Where moments before there had been only ruin and desolation, now life began to return, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as the taint of shadow lifted from the land. But Gandalf knew the respite would be brief. The Witch-king would return, stronger and more terrible than before, and when he did, all the north would tremble before his wrath. Already, the wizard could feel the weight of malice pressing down from the distant fortress of Carn Dûm, where ancient evils stirred in the depths of the earth. There was no time to lose. He must reach Rivendell with all speed, must gather the White Council and warn them of the storm that was about to break upon the world. For the rise of Angmar had begun in earnest, and only the combined wisdom of the wise might hope to stand against it. The halls of Rivendell rang with the voices of the mighty as Gandalf strode through the great doors, his grey cloak still bearing the dust of the northern roads, and his eyes shadowed with the weight of what he had seen. Elrond had summoned the White Council at the wizard's urgent request, and they had come with all speed. Saruman the White from his tower of Orthanc, Galadriel the Fair from her realm in Lothlorien, and Radagast the Brown from his wanderings in the wild places of the world. They sat now in the chamber where great decisions had been made throughout the long years of the Third Age, beneath tapestries that told the tale of Gil-galad's glory and banners that bore the symbols of kingdoms fallen and realms forgotten. The fire burned low in the great hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls of living stone, and through the tall windows could be seen the stars of evening beginning to shine above the valley. "The reports are disturbing indeed," Saruman was saying, his white robes rustling as he leaned forward in his chair. "Yet I wonder if we do not perhaps read too much into what may be mere coincidence. That the northern lands should know unrest is hardly surprising. They have been a breeding ground for darkness since the Witch-king first made his stronghold there." Galadriel's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, though her voice remained as serene as ever. "Coincidence, Saruman? When the Nine ride abroad again, and fell voices are heard speaking in the black speech, when ancient evils stir in their tombs and the very stones cry out with remembered pain, you counsel caution where boldness is needed, wisdom where action would serve us better. Peace, my friends," Elrond said, raising a hand to forestall further argument. "We are here to seek counsel, not to quarrel among ourselves. Gandalf has risked much to bring us this warning. Let us hear his words before we decide upon our course." The grey wizard rose from his seat and began to pace the length of the chamber, his staff clicking softly on the polished floor. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of prophecy, of one who had looked into the abyss and seen the shadows that gathered there. "I have stood in the ruins of Fornost," he said, "and felt the malice that seeps from every stone. I have walked in the blasted heath where villages once stood, and breathed air that tastes of ash and despair. I have faced the Witch-king himself in battle, and heard from his own lips the scope of his ambitions." He paused before the great map that covered one wall of the chamber, its careful tracery showing all the lands from the Grey Havens to the Sea of Rhûn. With one finger, he traced the borders of ancient Arthedain, now empty save for scattered settlements and the lonely watches of the rangers. "This is not a matter of mere unrest," he continued. "This is the beginning of a campaign of conquest that will not end until all the north lies under the shadow of Angmar. The Witch-king has been patient, gathering his strength in the dark places of the world. But now he moves openly. Even now his servants prepare the way, sowing terror and despair wherever they go." Radagast shifted uneasily in his seat, his brown robe stained with earth and his beard tangled with twigs and leaves. "The very birds flee from the northern lands," he said in his quiet voice. "The great eagles speak of a shadow that lies heavy upon Carn Dûm, and even the wolves avoid the paths that lead to that accursed place. The forest folk whisper of lights that dance in the sky and voices that call from empty air." Saruman's expression remained skeptical. "And yet," he said, "what would you have us do? March north with banners flying like the armies of old? We are not kings with hosts at our command, but guardians of wisdom and keepers of ancient law. Our strength lies not in the sword, but in counsel, not in war, but in the nurturing of hope." Hope? Gandalf turned from the map to face his fellow wizard, and there was fire in his grey eyes. "What hope can there be if we do nothing while evil gathers its strength? The Witch-king does not move alone in this. He has the backing of his master in Dol Guldur, and together they weave a web of shadow that may yet entangle all Middle-earth." He strode to the center of the chamber and planted his staff firmly on the floor, its crystal head beginning to glow with soft light. "I have seen the truth of it," he declared. "The necromancer and the lord of the Nazgûl work in concert, each serving the other's purposes. While we debate and delay, they act. While we counsel caution, they prepare for war." Elrond's face was grave as he considered the wizard's words. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then we face a threat beyond any we have known since the last alliance. The combined might of Dol Guldur and Angmar could indeed overwhelm the scattered forces of the free peoples, which is why we must act now," Gandalf pressed. "We must strike at Dol Guldur before the Witch-king's preparations are complete, drive the necromancer from his stronghold, and break the alliance before it can bear its bitter fruit." But Saruman shook his head, his expression set in lines of stubborn resistance. "Too hasty," he said firmly. "Too dangerous. If we move against Dol Guldur prematurely, we risk revealing our own strength before we are ready to use it effectively. Better to watch and wait, to gather more intelligence before we commit ourselves to open war." The debate continued deep into the night, voices rising and falling like the tide as the members of the White Council argued over the best course of action. Some supported Gandalf's call for immediate action, while others urged caution and further study. But through it all, the Grey Wizard could feel time slipping away like sand through his fingers, each moment of delay bringing the forces of darkness closer to their goal. And far to the north, in the depths of Carn Dûm, the Witch-king smiled beneath his iron crown as he felt the discord among his enemies. Let them debate and quarrel, he thought. Let them waste precious time in council while his armies gathered strength. Soon enough, they would learn the price of their hesitation when the terror of Angmar swept down upon them like a tide of shadow and steel. While the White Council debated in the halls of Rivendell, Gandalf had already set other wheels in motion. 3 days after the Great Gathering, he rode north once more, but this time his path led not toward the desolate wastes of Angmar, but to the hidden halls beneath the blue mountains where the remnants of Durin's folk had made their home in exile. The journey was long and perilous, for the roads had grown dangerous in recent months. Black riders were seen on the ancient ways, and fell voices echoed in the night air, speaking words in tongues that hurt the ear to hear. But Shadowfax bore his master swiftly through the perils, his silver hooves striking sparks from the stone as they climbed into the high places of the world. At last, they came to the great gates of the dwarf realm, carved from the living rock and sealed with doors of mithril that gleamed like starlight in the mountain's heart. Here Gandalf was received with honor, though he could sense the unease that lay heavy upon the dwarf lords who greeted him. "Dark times, Gandalf Greyhame," said Dane Ironfoot, Lord of the Iron Hills, as they walked through halls lit by crystal lamps. "Our scouts report strange movements in the northern wastes, armies gathering where no armies should be, and the sound of war horns echoing from empty lands." The wizard nodded grimly. "The Witch-king stirs once more," he said without preamble. His malice reaches out from Carn Dûm like grasping fingers, seeking to reclaim the dominion he once held over all the north. If the free peoples do not unite against him, we shall face the darkness alone and fall one by one to his malice. Dane's weathered face grew troubled as he considered these words. The dwarves had little love for the affairs of men, preferring to delve deep and guard their mountain treasures. But they remembered well the terror of the ancient days when the Witch King's armies had swept across Eriador like a plague of locusts. "What would you have us do?" he asked at length. "Our people are few, our halls far-flung. We cannot match the hosts of Angmar in open battle." "Not in open battle, no," Gandalf agreed. "But the dwarves have other strengths. Your knowledge of the secret ways beneath the mountains, your skill with forge and hammer, your stubborn courage in the face of overwhelming odds. These gifts may prove more valuable than any army." They talked long into the night, planning and preparing for the storm that was to come. Messages would be sent to the scattered holds of the dwarves, calling upon them to remember their ancient oaths. Weapons would be forged in the deep fires, armor hammered out on anvils that had rung with the sound of creation since the elder days. But even as they spoke, both knew that preparation alone would not be enough. The enemy's strength was vast, his malice ancient and deep-rooted. If the free peoples were to have any hope of victory, they would need more than weapons and walls. They would need hope itself, kindled in the darkest hours when all seemed lost. From the halls of the dwarves, Gandalf's path led south and west, through the wild lands of Rudor and across the Weather Hills, until at last he came to the borders of the Shire. Here the world seemed suddenly peaceful again, as if the shadow that lay so heavy on the northern lands had no power to penetrate the green hedgerows and rolling meadows where the hobbits made their quiet homes. The Green Dragon at Bywater was warm and welcoming after the cold mountain halls, filled with the sound of laughter and the scent of pipe smoke. Here, Gandalf found Bilbo Baggins sitting by the fire, older now than when they had first met, his hair silver white and his face lined with the wisdom that comes from having seen wonders beyond the borders of the ordinary world. "Gandalf!" Bilbo exclaimed, rising from his chair with evident delight. "I wondered when you might come this way again. You bring news from the wide world, I suppose. Nothing too terrible, I hope. We have had quite enough excitement to last us several lifetimes." The wizard smiled, though his eyes remained grave. "Perhaps more than you know, old friend," he said quietly. "The shadow stirs once more in the northern lands, and I fear the days of peace are numbered. But come, let us not speak of such dark matters here, where the fire burns bright and the ale flows freely." They talked of many things as the evening wore on, of the Shire and its gentle folk, of the great adventure that had taken Bilbo far from home, of the dragon's treasure and the battle that had followed. But always the conversation returned to one small object, a simple gold ring that the hobbit wore on a chain about his neck. "Still the same old ring," Bilbo said with a fond smile, touching it gently with one finger. "My birthday present, you know. Quite useful for avoiding unwanted visitors, which reminds me, you never did tell me exactly what it was or where it might have come from." Gandalf's expression grew suddenly intent, and he leaned forward in his chair. "The ring troubles me, Bilbo," he said softly. "There is something about it that sets my teeth on edge, some quality that speaks of powers older and darker than you might imagine. Where did you say you found it again?" "Found it?" Bilbo looked puzzled for a moment, then his face cleared. "Oh, in the goblin tunnels, of course. Won it from that wretched creature Gollum in a game of riddles. Fair and square, as I told you before." But even as he spoke the words, Gandalf caught something in his tone, a slight hesitation, a shadow that passed across his eyes like a cloud before the sun. It was as if the hobbit were repeating a story he had told many times, but one that did not quite ring true even to his own ears. "Yes," the wizard said slowly. "So, you have told me. But I wonder, have you ever noticed anything strange about the ring? Does it ever feel heavier than it should, or seem to glow with its own light? Do you ever hear voices when you wear it, or see things that others cannot see?" Bilbo's hand moved instinctively to the chain about his neck, his fingers closing protectively around the ring. "Nothing like that," he said quickly, too quickly, perhaps. "It's just a magic ring, nothing more. Makes me invisible when I slip it on, which is quite convenient when the Sackville Bagginses come calling." He laughed then, but the sound was forced, and Gandalf noted how his eyes refused to meet the wizard's gaze. There were secrets here, the Grey Pilgrim realized, secrets that perhaps even Bilbo himself did not fully understand. "Perhaps," Gandalf said quietly, "but I would ask you to be careful, old friend. Magic of any kind can be dangerous, especially when its true nature is unknown. Promise me that if anything strange should happen, anything at all, you will send word to me at once." Bilbo nodded, though his grip on the ring did not loosen. "Of course," he said, "though I cannot imagine what could possibly happen here in the Shire. We are quite beyond the reach of such troubles, surely." But even as he spoke the words, both he and Gandalf could feel the weight of approaching storm, the sense that the peaceful days were drawing to a close. In the distance, barely audible above the sound of voices and laughter, came the faint echo of hoofbeats on the road, riders moving swiftly through the night, their purpose dark and their destination unknown. In the ruins of Carn Dûm, where the stones themselves were steeped in malice, and the very air seemed thick with the weight of ancient evil, the Witch-king stood upon the highest tower and gazed out over his dominion. Far below, in the courtyards and halls of the fortress, his servants went about their dark business, orcs sharpening their blades, trolls hauling great stones to repair the broken walls, and darker things still that shunned the light and moved only in shadow. The preparations were nearly complete. For months now, ever since his awakening from the long sleep of exile, he had been gathering his strength and calling his servants to him. From the depths of the misty mountains had come the orc tribes eager for war and plunder. From the wild lands of Rudor had come the hillmen, their hearts turned to darkness by promises of gold and power. And from realms even more distant had come creatures that had no names in the tongues of the free peoples, beings of shadow and flame that served only malice and delighted only in destruction. But it was not enough. The Witch-king was too wise in the ways of war to rely on mere numbers, however vast they might be. He had learned, in the long years of his first defeat, that victory required more than strength. It required cunning, patience, and above all, the ability to strike where the enemy least expected it. "My lord," came a voice from the shadows behind him. The Witch-king did not turn, for he recognized the speaker, one of his most trusted servants, a creature that had once been a man, but was now something altogether more terrible. "Speak," the Lord of the Nazgûl commanded, his voice like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. "The scouts have returned from the south. They bring word of great import. The White Council has met in Rivendell, and they plan to move against Dol Guldur within the month. Our master's stronghold in Mirkwood is threatened." A sound that might have been laughter echoed from beneath the Witch-king's iron crown. "Let them come," he said. "Let them waste their strength against shadows and illusion, while the real blow falls elsewhere. The necromancer has served his purpose. His presence in Dol Guldur has drawn their attention and divided their forces. Now it is time for the true war to begin." He turned then to face his servant, and though his features remained hidden in the depths of his hood, there was something in his bearing that spoke of terrible purpose. "Send word to all our captains," he commanded. "Let the armies of Angmar be made ready for war. When the moon is dark and the stars are hidden, we march south. Fornost shall fall before the first snows, and by spring the banner of the Iron Crown shall fly over all the lands of Eriador." The servant bowed low and withdrew, leaving the Witch-king alone upon his tower. Below him, the fortress of Carn Dûm pulsed with dark life as his commands were carried out, and from every corner of his realm came the sound of preparation, the ring of hammer on anvil, the tramp of marching feet, and the howling of fell beasts eager for the hunt. Far to the south, in the peaceful halls of Rivendell, Elrond felt a sudden chill pass through his heart, though he could not say why. The white gems of his crown grew dim for a moment, as if some shadow had passed between them and the stars, and the very air seemed to grow thick and hard to breathe. "The storm breaks at last," he murmured to himself, and sent out the call for his captains to make ready for war. In the depths of the lonely mountain, where the treasures of kings lay piled in glittering heaps, Smaug the Golden stirred in his sleep and opened one enormous eye. The great dragon had slumbered long in the halls of Erebor, dreaming of fire and gold and the terror he had once brought to all the lands of the north. But now something had awakened him, a disturbance in the very fabric of Middle-earth, a sense that the long peace was ending and the time of war had come again. He raised his mighty head, scales scraping against the stone ceiling as he tested the air with his forked tongue. There were new scents on the wind, the smell of armies gathering, of weapons being forged, of fear and hatred rising like smoke from 1,000 different sources. And beneath it all was something else, something that made his ancient heart quicken with dark anticipation. So, he rumbled to himself, his voice echoing through the empty halls like distant thunder. The little folk prepare for war again. How interesting. For Smaug was far more than a mere beast of destruction. In the long years of his dominion over Erebor, he had learned to read the currents of power that flowed through Middle-earth, to sense the great movements of history as they shaped themselves in the shadows. He knew that war was coming, had known it for months, as the darkness gathered in the north and the ancient powers began to stir once more. The dragon had no love for any of the free peoples, but neither did he wish to see the shadow victorious. Sauron's return would mean a world remade according to the Dark Lord's will, a realm of ash and shadow where even the great dragons would be reduced to mere servants. Better by far that the forces of light and darkness should exhaust themselves in endless conflict, leaving the field clear for those who served neither side. But there was another consideration, one that touched the very heart of Smaug's being. Deep in his hoard, buried beneath mountains of gold and silver, lay objects of power that the dragon had claimed in his long years of conquest. Rings and amulets, swords and crowns, artifacts that pulsed with their own inner light and whispered of secrets better left unknown. Chief among these was a palantir, one of the 7 seeing stones of Númenor, which had fallen into Smaug's claws during the sack of a forgotten kingdom. Through it, the dragon could watch the movements of his enemies and allies alike, seeing events as they unfolded across the breadth of Middle-earth. Now, he turned his attention to that dark crystal, letting his consciousness sink into its swirling depths. Images flashed before his reptilian gaze, armies on the march, cities under siege, and in the center of it all, a figure wrapped in shadow and crowned with iron, directing the movements of war like a master chess player arranging his pieces on the board. The Witch-king of Angmar had returned, and with him came the promise of devastation, such as the North had not known since the dark years of the Second Age. Smaug watched with interest as the Lord of the Nazgûl's plans unfolded, noting the cleverness of his strategy and the terrible patience with which he had prepared for this moment. But the dragon's attention was drawn to something else as well, a small disturbance in the flow of power, a ripple in the great currents that spoke of secrets yet to be revealed. Somewhere in Middle-earth, an object of immense importance was stirring, calling to powers both light and dark, with a voice that had been silent for long ages. Smaug's eyes narrowed as he focused on that distant signal, trying to trace its source through the maze of possibilities that stretched out before him. What he found there filled even his ancient heart with something approaching awe. "The One Ring," he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the silence of his treasure chamber. After all these years, the Master Ring stirs again. But where, and in whose possession does it lie? The dragon's mind raced as he considered the implications. If the One Ring had indeed survived the destruction of Isildur, then the entire balance of power in Middle-earth was about to shift in ways that none could predict. The ring's return would call to all the other rings of power, awakening them from their slumber and binding them once more to the will of their creator. But it would also offer opportunities to those clever enough to seize them. For the ring was not merely a tool of domination. It was power itself, raw and unlimited, waiting for a strong will to claim it and bend it to their purpose. Smaug smiled then, an expression that would have frozen the blood of any who saw it. The game was about to become far more interesting than anyone suspected, and the great dragon intended to play his part to the full. In the armories of Rivendell, where the weapons of heroes lay stored against the day of their need, Elrond stood before a case of crystal and mithril, his face grave with the weight of approaching sorrow. Within that case, wrapped in silk of samite white, lay the shards of Narsil, the sword that had been broken in the battle against Sauron, when Gil-galad, the Elven king, had fallen, and Isildur had cut the ring from the Dark Lord's hand. For 3,000 years, the broken blade had waited here, its edges still keen despite the passage of ages, its metal still bright with the light of stars that had shone in Valinor before the making of the world. The prophecies spoke of a day when it would be reforged, when the heir of Isildur would take it up once more and lead the free peoples to victory against the shadow. But that day seemed as distant as ever, for the line of kings had failed in the north, and Isildur's heirs were scattered like leaves before the wind. "The time draws near," said a voice behind him, and Elrond turned to see Glorfindel approaching, his golden hair shining in the light of the Elf Lord's crown. The mighty warrior bore the look of one who had seen battle in the elder days, when the hosts of Valinor had marched against Morgoth, and the very mountains had trembled beneath their feet. "Does it?" Elrond replied, his voice heavy with doubt. "The line of Isildur is broken, Glorfindel. Arvedui was the last of the kings, and he lies now beneath the ice of Foreshell Bay. Who then shall wield the sword when it is remade? Who shall unite the scattered remnants of Arnor under one banner?" Glorfindel smiled, though there was sadness in his eyes. "The blood of Númenor runs still in the veins of the Dúnedain," he said gently. "Though they know it not, the rangers who guard the borders of the north are the heirs of ancient kings. When the hour of need comes, one shall arise among them who bears the right to claim his inheritance." "Perhaps," Elrond conceded, "but until that day, Narsil must remain broken, and the throne of Gondor must remain empty. The stewards rule wisely in Minas Tirith, but they are not kings, and their authority extends only so far as their armies can march." He turned back to the crystal case, his gaze fixed on the broken blade within. "Sometimes I wonder if we were right to preserve it," he said softly. "The sword is a symbol of hope, yes, but it is also a reminder of failure, of the day when victory turned to defeat and the chance to end the shadow forever was lost." "Hope is never a mistake," Glorfindel replied firmly. "Even when it seems most foolish, even when all the wise counsel despair, hope endures. And from that endurance comes the strength to continue the fight, generation after generation, until at last the victory is won." As if summoned by their words, a figure appeared in the doorway of the armory, a young man dressed in the grey cloak and leather jerkin of a ranger, his dark hair hanging loose about his shoulders, and his grey eyes bright with the light of ancient courage. This was Arathorn, son of Arador, called the Grey Wolf for his skill in the hunt. And though he knew it not, the blood of Isildur ran strong in his veins. "My lords," he said, bowing low as was fitting in the presence of the mighty, "I bring word from the north. The ranger companies have gathered at Fornost according to your summons, and we await your orders. But I must tell you truly, Our numbers are few, and the enemy's strength is vast. We cannot hope to hold the city against a full assault." Elrond studied the young ranger with eyes that had looked upon the glory of Númenor and the terror of the last alliance. There was something about this one that reminded him of Isildur himself in his youth. The same proud bearing, the same steadfast courage, the same willingness to stand against impossible odds. "You are Arathorn of the Dúnedain," he said, and it was not a question. "Your lineage is known to me, though you may not know it yourself. The blood of kings runs in your veins, young ranger, and the day may come when you are called to claim a heritage you never suspected." Arathorn looked puzzled, but before he could speak, the sound of horns echoed through the valley, the clear, bright notes of the horns of Rivendell, calling all defenders to their posts. From the watchtowers came the cry that all had dreaded to hear: "Black riders on the road! The Nine are abroad!" Elrond's face grew stern as he heard that fell news. "So it begins," he said grimly. "The war we have long feared is upon us at last. Go now, Arathorn, son of Arador, and gather your men. The defense of the north rests upon the rangers now, as it has for many long years. Do not let that burden fall lightly upon your shoulders." The young ranger bowed and departed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Behind him, Elrond and Glorfindel stood in silence before the broken blade, each lost in his own thoughts of what was to come. "The wheel turns," Glorfindel said at last. "The patterns of the past repeat themselves, but never exactly as they were before. This time, perhaps, the ending will be different." "Perhaps," Elrond agreed, "but the price of that difference may be higher than any of us can bear to pay." The assault on Fornost came with the turning of the year, when the snow lay thick upon the ground and the rivers ran black with ice. The Witch-king's armies descended from the north like a tide of darkness, their banners black against the white landscape and their war cries echoing from the hills like the howling of wolves. But they found the city prepared for their coming. Under Arathorn's leadership, the Rangers had turned Fornost into a fortress, its broken walls repaired with stone and timber, its towers manned with the finest archers in all Eriador. The great gates had been reinforced with bands of iron, and deep trenches had been dug before the walls, filled with stakes and set with hidden traps. For 7 days and 7 nights, the battle raged as the forces of Angmar hurled themselves against the defenses of the city. Orcs swarmed up scaling ladders only to be met by the bright swords of the Dúnedain. Trolls battered at the gates with great hammers, but the iron bands held firm. Even the fell beasts of the air found no easy prey among the defenders, for the Rangers were skilled with bow and blade alike. But numbers will tell in the end, and the enemy's strength was vast beyond counting. On the 8th day, when the walls were breached and the inner defenses overrun, Arathorn made the hardest decision a commander can make. Rather than see his men slaughtered to no purpose, he ordered the retreat, leading the survivors out through secret passages that had been prepared for this possibility. As they fought their way clear of the burning city, the young ranger turned for one last look at the ruins of Fornost Iran. The palace of his ancestors, though he knew it not, was wreathed in flames, and the banner of the Iron Crown flew from its highest tower. The last stronghold of the North Kingdom had fallen, and with it died the last hope of restoring the realm of Arthedain. But though the city was lost, The spirit of resistance was not broken. In the wild lands beyond the borders of the Old Kingdom, the Rangers continued their fight, striking at the enemy's supply lines and harassing his patrols. They could not hope to defeat the Witch-king's armies in open battle, but they could make his victory costly and his reign uncertain. And in the halls of Rivendell, Elrond received word of the city's fall with a heavy heart but an unbroken will. "The kingdom of Arthedain is ended," he said to the members of his council, "but the line of its kings endures, though they know it not. One day, when the wheel of time has turned full circle, the throne shall be reclaimed and the crown restored. Until that day, we must hold fast to hope and continue the long defeat." Far to the north, in the ruins of Carn Dûm, where the Witch King held court in triumph, the Lord of the Nazgûl gazed out over his reclaimed dominion and smiled beneath his iron crown. The first phase of his plan was complete. The North Kingdom was broken, its cities in ruins, its people scattered to the winds. But this was only the beginning. Beyond the borders of his realm lay richer prizes still, the halls of Rivendell, where the elves kept their ancient lore, the Shire, where the hobbits dwelt in ignorant peace, and far to the south, the white city of Minas Tirith, where the stewards of Gondor maintained their lonely watch. All of these would fall in time, when his strength was fully restored and his preparations complete. The shadow of Angmar would spread across all Middle-earth, and the free peoples would learn once more to fear the coming of the Nine. But even in his moment of triumph, the Witch King felt a stirring of unease. Somewhere in the depths of his awareness, a power was awakening that he had not felt for many long years, the call of the One Ring, growing stronger with each passing day. His master Sauron was stirring in Barad-dûr, and when he rose to full power once more, the world would tremble before his wrath. The game was far from over, and the greatest moves were yet to be played. In the quiet comfort of Bag End, where the fire burned bright in the hearth and the kettle sang on the hob, Bilbo Baggins sat in his favorite chair and tried to forget the troubles of the wide world. The news that came from beyond the borders of the Shire grew darker with each passing day. Tales of war in the north, of cities fallen and kingdoms broken, of refugees streaming southward before the advancing shadow. But here, in his comfortable hobbit hole, surrounded by the familiar warmth of home, such things seemed as distant as the stars. The great affairs of kings and wizards were not for the likes of hobbits, who preferred their adventures in books rather than in life. Yet even in the Shire, changes were stirring. The roads that had once been peaceful now saw strange travelers, tall men in grey cloaks who spoke little and watched much, their hands never far from their sword hilts. And sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, riders could be heard passing swiftly along the great East Road, their hoofbeats drumming like thunder on the ancient stones. Bilbo tried not to think about such things, focusing instead on his writing and his gardening, on the simple pleasures that had always brought him contentment. But lately, he found his hand straying often to his pocket, where the ring lay warm against his fingers, and when he touched it, a strange sense of unease would steal over him. The ring had grown heavier of late, though its weight remained unchanged when he placed it on the scales in his pantry. And sometimes, when he held it up to the light, he thought he could see symbols etched into its golden surface, symbols that shifted and changed even as he watched, as if the metal itself were alive. "My precious," he would whisper sometimes when he thought no one could hear. The words came unbidden to his lips, spoken in a voice that did not quite sound like his own. My birthday present. It was during one such moment, as he sat gazing into the fire with the ring clasped in his palm, that a knock came at his door. Bilbo started, quickly slipping the ring back into his pocket before going to see who had come calling at such a late hour. To his surprise, he found Gandalf the Grey standing on his doorstep, his tall staff gleaming in the moonlight, and his grey cloak pulled close about his shoulders. The wizard's face was grave, and his eyes held a weight of sorrow that made Bilbo's heart sink with foreboding. "Gandalf," he exclaimed, stepping aside to let his old friend enter. "How good to see you again, though I fear you bring dark news from the north. Come in, come in. The night is cold, and you look as though you have traveled far." The wizard entered without a word, settling himself in the chair opposite Bilbo's with a weariness that spoke of long roads and heavy burdens. For a moment, he said nothing, staring into the fire as if seeing visions of things that might have been or were yet to come. "The North Kingdom has fallen," he said at last, his voice heavy with grief. "Fornost is in ruins, its people scattered, its king lies beneath the ice of the northern seas. The line of Isildur is broken, and the realm of Arthedain is no more." Bilbo felt a chill run through him at these words, though he could not say why the fate of distant kingdoms should trouble him so deeply. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I know you had friends among the Dunedain. Is there nothing to be done?" Gandalf turned to look at him then, and in the wizard's grey eyes Bilbo saw a depth of pain that went beyond mere sorrow for fallen kingdoms. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but it will require sacrifices that none can foresee, and courage from the most unlikely sources. Tell me, old friend, do you still have that ring you found in the goblin tunnels?" Bilbo's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, his fingers closing around the familiar circle of gold. "Of course," he said, though something in his tone suggested reluctance to discuss the matter. "Why do you ask?" "I have been thinking about it," Gandalf replied, his gaze never leaving Bilbo's face. "There are things about that ring that trouble me, patterns of power that speak of a maker whose identity I dare not name. I fear that what you carry may be more dangerous than either of us suspected." "Dangerous?" Bilbo forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "It's just a magic ring, nothing more. Makes me invisible when I put it on, which is quite convenient when unwanted visitors come calling." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the ring growing warm in his pocket, and for a moment he thought he heard a voice whispering in a language he did not know, words that seemed to burn like acid on the air and fill his mind with visions of fire and shadow. "Perhaps," Gandalf said, though his expression remained troubled. "But I would ask you to be careful, Bilbo. Magic of any kind can be perilous, especially when its true nature is unknown. And these are dark times, when powers long thought destroyed are stirring once more in the depths of the world." They talked long into the night, though neither spoke again of the ring directly, but both could feel its presence like a weight in the room. And when at last Gandalf departed with the coming of dawn, Bilbo was left with the uncomfortable feeling that his comfortable life was about to change in ways he could not predict. In his pocket, the ring pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat, and far away in the darkness of Barad-dûr, The Dark Lord stirred in his sleep and smiled. The assault on Dol Guldur came at last in the spring of the following year, when the White Council could no longer ignore the growing threat from the necromancer's stronghold. Saruman led the attack, his power blazing white as lightning as he drove back the shadows that had claimed the fortress for so long. Beside him rode Elrond and Galadriel, their ancient wisdom and strength combining to cleanse the corruption from stone and timber that had festered there for centuries. The battle was terrible to behold, as light clashed with shadow in displays of power that shook the very foundations of Middle-earth. The trees of Mirkwood swayed and groaned as the conflict raged, and even the birds fled from the sky as the opposing forces met in final confrontation. But when the White Council breached the highest tower, where the necromancer had held court for so many dark years, they found it empty. The enemy had fled before their coming, taking with him the 9 rings and all the lesser artifacts of power that he had gathered. Only shadows remained, and the echo of mocking laughter that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Too late," Saruman said, his voice heavy with disappointment as he surveyed the abandoned chamber. "We moved too slowly, debated too long while our enemy prepared his escape. The necromancer has slipped through our fingers once again." But Gandalf's expression was more troubled than disappointed, for he, alone among them, suspected the true identity of their foe. This was no mere fallen wizard they had faced, no petty sorcerer seeking power for its own sake. This was Sauron himself, the Dark Lord of Mordor, and his withdrawal from Dol Guldur was not defeat, but strategic retreat. "He flees east," Galadriel said, her fair face pale with the effort of her struggle against the darkness. "I can feel his malice like a weight upon the wind, drawing back toward the shadows of Mordor where his true strength lies." "Then let him go," Saruman declared, though there was less certainty in his voice than his words suggested. "Dol Guldur is cleansed, the shadow lifted from Mirkwood at last. Our work here is done and done well." But even as he spoke, they all knew the victory was hollow. The necromancer might be gone from his western stronghold, but he was not defeated. Somewhere in the darkness of Mordor, in the ruins of Barad-dûr or the fires of Mount Doom, he was even now preparing for his next move in the great game. And in the north, the Witch-king felt his master's retreat like a physical blow. The alliance between Dol Guldur and Angmar was broken, at least for now, and he would have to proceed with his own plans without the support he had counted upon. But the Lord of the Nazgûl was not without resources of his own. For centuries, he had prepared for this moment, gathering power in the ruins of his ancient realm, binding to his will all manner of fell creatures. If he could not count on his master's direct aid, then he would forge victory with his own strength. The war for the north would continue, but it would be a different war than the one he had originally planned. Grimmer, more desperate, fought with the fury of one who knows that failure means not merely defeat, but utter annihilation. Yet even as the Witch-king made his new plans, the seeds of his own downfall were already being sown. For in driving the necromancer from Dol Guldur, the White Council had freed Sauron to return to his ancient stronghold in Mordor, where his power would grow beyond all previous measure. And when that happened, when the Dark Lord rose to full strength once more, there would be no room in Middle-earth for rival powers, not even those who had served him faithfully for so long. The Witch King's triumph in the north would prove to be the very thing that ensured his ultimate destruction, though he knew it not. The wheel of fate was turning, and all who sought to master it would find themselves crushed beneath its weight. As the second millennium of the Third Age drew toward its close, the lands of Eriador lay under a shadow deeper than any that had fallen since the days of the last alliance. The Witch King's dominion stretched from the ruins of Fornost to the borders of the Shire, and his malice poisoned the very air that men breathed. Yet even in that darkest hour, when all seemed lost and the shadow lay heavy upon the north, there remained those who would not yield to despair. In the hidden refuges of the ranges, where the remnants of the Dunedain kept their ancient watch, hope endured like a small flame in the darkness. They were few now, scattered and hunted, but they remembered still the glory of their fathers and the oaths they had sworn to protect the innocent. Arathorn the Grey Wolf had become their leader in those dark days, though he bore no crown and claimed no throne. Under his guidance, the Rangers fought their hidden war against the shadow, striking at the enemy's outposts and vanishing into the wild before his wrath could find them. They could not defeat the Witch King's armies in open battle, but they could make his victory costly and his reign uncertain. And in the halls of Rivendell, Elrond kept vigil over the refugees who had fled the northern kingdoms, offering what healing and comfort he could to those who had lost everything. The Hidden Valley had become an island of peace in a sea of troubles, protected by the power of Vilya and the wisdom of its lord. The darkness will not endure forever. The Elf Lord would tell those who came to him in their despair. It never has, in all the long years of the world's turning. Even the longest night must end at last, and when the dawn comes, it will find us ready. In the depths of the Shire, where the hobbits tended their gardens and went about their quiet business, life continued much as it always had. The great affairs of kings and wizards seemed as distant as the stars, and if dark riders were sometimes seen on the roads, well, that was a matter for the big folk to worry about. Bilbo Baggins still sat by his fire in Bag End, writing in the great red book that would one day be known as There and Back Again. The ring still lay heavy in his pocket, heavier now than it had ever been before, and sometimes, in the small hours of the night, he would take it out and hold it up to the firelight, watching the way it seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. He did not know, could not know, that he carried in his pocket the fate of all Middle-earth, the one thing that could either save the free peoples or ensure their final destruction. The ring that had seemed such a simple treasure was in truth the Master Ring, the one ring of power that Sauron had forged in the fires of Mount Doom to rule over all the others. But that knowledge would come later, in another age, when the wheel of time had turned full circle and the final battle between light and shadow was at hand. For now, it was enough that hope endured, in the hearts of the Rangers who kept their watch, in the halls of Rivendell where healing and wisdom dwelt, and in the simple courage of ordinary folk who refused to let the darkness into their hearts. The rise of Angmar had brought great suffering to the north, and the Witch King's shadow would lie heavy upon the land for many years to come. But it had also revealed the strength that lay hidden in the free peoples, the flame that could not be extinguished, no matter how fierce the storm that raged around it. And in the turning of the years, when the Third Age had run its course and the time of the ring-bearer had come at last, that flame would kindle into a fire that would consume the shadow and restore the light to all the corners of Middle-earth. The tale of Angmar was ended, but the greater story had only just begun. In the green hills of the Shire, a power slept that would one day wake the world. And when it did, all the sorrows of the past would be but preparation for the joy that was to come. Thus ends the tale of the rise of Angmar, as it was told in the days when memory was longer and the hearts of men were filled with both shadow and light in equal measure. The rise of Angmar, a Middle-earth epic for quiet hours